The morning I was sold like livestock, the sun rose blood red over the Silverwood Pack territory, as if the sky itself knew what betrayal was about to unfold. I stood in the kitchen of our modest cabin, stirring porridge that had grown cold while I waited for my father to return from his important meeting with the pack elders. At 19, I had learned to read the signs of trouble in our household, but nothing could have prepared me for the conversation I was about to overhear. My name is Luna Blackthorne, and I was born into the lowest tier of the Silverwood Pack hierarchy. My father, Marcus Blackthorne, was a Gamma-ranked wolf whose gambling addiction had slowly drained our family's resources over the years. My mother, Sarah, had died when I was 12, leaving behind only her silver pendant and the faint memory of her gentle voice singing lullabies. Since then, I had become the caretaker of our small family, which included my younger brother Tommy, who was only 14 and still hadn't experienced his first shift. The sound of heavy footsteps on our porch made my stomach clench with anxiety. I recognized my father's uneven gait, but there were other footsteps too. Measured, authoritative steps that belonged to someone of higher rank. Through the thin walls of our cabin, I could hear voices, and instinctively, I pressed myself against the door to listen. "The debt is substantial, Marcus," came a cold, unfamiliar voice. 50,000 in gold. The interest alone is more than your annual pack allowance." I know. My father's voice was strained, desperate, "but I can pay it back. Just give me more time. The next full moon hunt." "You've had 6 months of more time," the voice interrupted. "Alpha Donovan is not known for his patience with debtors. However, he has made you an offer." My blood ran cold. Alpha Donovan of the Ironclad Pack was notorious throughout the region for his ruthless business dealings and his treatment of those who owed him money. Stories circulated about wolves who had crossed him and were never seen again. "What kind of offer?" my father asked, though his voice suggested he already dreaded the answer. "Your daughter. Luna, isn't it? She's of age, unmated, and from what I understand, quite attractive. Alpha Donovan is in need of a personal servant for his estate. The arrangement would clear your debt entirely." The wooden spoon in my hand clattered to the floor. I felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. My own father was discussing selling me to pay off his gambling debts. "She's my daughter," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And she's also your salvation," the voice replied smoothly. "Alpha Donovan is being generous. Most alphas would simply take what they're owed by force. This way your daughter gets to live, you keep your life, and your debt disappears. Everyone wins." "What about Tommy? What about—" "Your son will be provided for. Alpha Donovan is not unreasonable. But Luna comes with us today, or we collect our debt in other ways. I trust you understand what that means." The silence that followed was deafening. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. In that moment of quiet, I could hear my father's labored breathing, the sound of a man wrestling with his conscience and losing. "How long?" my father finally asked. "The contract is for 5 years. After that, if she's served well, she'll be free to go." 5 years. 5 years of my life, sold to pay for my father's mistakes. I thought of Tommy, still so young, still needing guidance as he approached his first transformation. I thought of the dreams I'd harbored of maybe finding my mate, of having a family of my own someday. "I need to tell her," my father said. "No need. We'll handle the explanation. Pack her belongings. We leave within the hour." I heard chairs scraping against the floor and realized the meeting was ending. Panic flooded through me as I scrambled away from the door and back to the stove, trying to look as though I'd been cooking the entire time. But my hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold the spoon. The front door opened, and my father entered, followed by a tall man in an expensive black coat. The stranger had the bearing of a beta, confident, well-fed, with the kind of clothes that spoke of wealth and power. His eyes, when they fell on me, were calculating, appraising me like a piece of merchandise. "Luna," my father's voice was barely above a whisper. "This is Beta Morrison from the Ironclad Pack. He's here to discuss an opportunity." I turned to face them, trying to keep my expression neutral despite the storm raging inside me. "What kind of opportunity?" Beta Morrison stepped forward, his smile cold and professional. "Miss Blackthorne, Alpha Donovan has offered you a position in his household. It's a great honor. Very few wolves from outside his pack are given such opportunities." "What kind of position?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Personal service. You'll be well-fed, well-housed, and compensated for your work. The contract is for 5 years. I looked at my father, searching his face for any sign of regret, any indication that he might fight for me. Instead, I saw only shame and the desperate relief of a man who had found a way out of his problems. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Beta Morrison's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew harder. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Miss Blackthorne. Your father has already agreed to the terms. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I had spent years taking care of our family, sacrificing my own desires to keep us together. And this was how I was repaid. But as I looked at my father's haggard face, I realized that refusing would likely mean death for him, and possibly for Tommy as well. "How long do I have to pack?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. 30 minutes, Beta Morrison replied. "Travel light. You'll be provided with appropriate clothing once you arrive." I nodded and walked to the small room I shared with Tommy, who was thankfully at school and wouldn't witness this transaction. I pulled out the old canvas bag my mother had used for traveling and began filling it with my few possessions. Some clothes, my mother's silver pendant, a few books, and a small wooden carving Tommy had made for my birthday. As I packed, I could hear my father and Beta Morrison discussing the details of the arrangement in low voices. Words like obedience, discipline, and consequences drifted through the thin walls, each one driving home the reality of what was happening to me. When I emerged from my room, bag in hand, my father was standing by the window, staring out at the forest beyond our property. He couldn't meet my eyes. "Tommy," I said. "Someone needs to tell Tommy." "I'll handle it," my father said, his voice hollow. "You'll take care of him? You'll make sure he eats? That he does his schoolwork? That he—" "Luna." Beta Morrison's voice cut through my desperate instructions. "It's time." I looked around our small cabin one last time, memorizing every detail. The crooked shelf my father had built when I was 10, the faded curtains my mother had sewn, the scratches on the doorframe where Tommy and I had marked our heights over the years. This had been my entire world, and now I was leaving it behind. "Goodbye, Papa," I said softly. He finally turned to look at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "Luna, Don't," I interrupted. "Just take care of Tommy." Beta Morrison gestured toward the door, and I followed him outside. A sleek black car waited in our driveway, looking completely out of place in our humble neighborhood. The driver, another well-dressed wolf, opened the rear door for me. As I slid into the leather seat, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Henderson from next door peering through her curtains. The shame of being seen like this, of having the whole pack know that I'd been sold to pay my father's debts, burned in my chest. The car pulled away from the only home I'd ever known, and I watched through the rear window as my father stood in the doorway, growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared entirely. I pressed my mother's pendant against my chest and made a silent promise. Somehow, someday, I would return. And when I did, I would be strong enough to ensure that no one could ever sell me again. Beta Morrison sat beside me in silence for most of the journey, occasionally making phone calls in a language I didn't recognize. The landscape outside changed from the familiar forests of Silverwood territory to rolling hills, and eventually to the imposing mountains that surrounded Ironclad Pack lands. As we drove through the gates of the Ironclad estate, I got my first glimpse of my new prison. The main house was a massive stone structure that looked more like a fortress than a home, with tall windows that reflected the afternoon sun like watching eyes. Gardens stretched out on either side, maintained with military precision, and I could see other buildings scattered throughout the property: guest houses, training facilities, and what looked like barracks for the Pack's warriors. "Impressive, isn't it?" Beta Morrison said, noticing my stare. "Alpha Donovan has built quite an empire here." The car stopped in front of the main entrance, where a stern-looking woman in a black dress waited. She appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of posture that suggested she tolerated no nonsense. "That's Mrs. Hartwell," Beta Morrison explained as we got out of the car. "She manages the household staff. You'll report directly to her." Mrs. Hartwell approached us with brisk efficiency. "Miss Blackthorne, I presume? I am the head of household. You will address me as Mrs. Hartwell at all times. Beta Morrison, Alpha Donovan is waiting for you in his study." Beta Morrison nodded and disappeared into the house, leaving me alone with Mrs. Hartwell. She looked me up and down with the same appraising expression I'd seen from Beta Morrison, though hers seemed more focused on practical considerations. "You're smaller than I expected," she said finally, "but that may work in your favor. Alpha Donovan prefers his staff to be unobtrusive. Come, I'll show you to your quarters and explain your duties." I followed her through a side entrance into a maze of corridors that seemed designed to confuse anyone unfamiliar with the layout. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced wolves who I assumed were previous Ironclad Alphas, their eyes seeming to track our movement. "You'll be working primarily in the main house," Mrs. Hartwell explained as we walked, "cleaning, serving meals, maintaining Alpha Donovan's personal spaces. The work is demanding, but if you're diligent and keep your head down, you'll find your time here passes quickly." We stopped in front of a plain wooden door. "This is your room. You'll share it with Mira, another girl from outside the pack. She's been here for 2 years and can help you learn the routines." The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds, a shared dresser, and a single window that looked out onto the servants' courtyard. It was a far cry from the cozy bedroom I'd shared with Tommy, but it was better than I'd feared. "Dinner is at 6 in the servants' hall," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "You'll start work tomorrow at dawn. Alpha Donovan has very specific requirements, and deviation from his preferences is not tolerated. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mrs. Hartwell." "Good. One more thing, Miss Blackthorne. Alpha Donovan values discretion above all else. You will see and hear many things in this house. You will speak of none of them to anyone inside or outside this pack. The consequences for gossip are severe." With that ominous warning, she left me alone in my new room. I sat on the bed that would be mine for the next 5 years, and finally allowed myself to cry. I cried for the life I'd lost, for the family that had betrayed me, and for the uncertain future that stretched ahead. But even as tears streamed down my face, I felt something else stirring inside me, a fierce determination that surprised me with its intensity. I had been sold, yes, but I was not broken. I would survive this, and somehow I would find a way to reclaim my freedom. I had no idea that my true destiny was about to begin, or that the powerful Alpha who now owned my contract would soon discover that I was far more than just another servant girl. The moon goddess had plans for me that neither my father's betrayal nor Alpha Donovan's wealth could change. As night fell over the ironclad estate, I pressed my mother's pendant to my lips and whispered a prayer to the moon goddess for strength. Tomorrow my new life would begin, and I intended to face it with my head held high. Dawn came too early in the Ironclad Pack house, announced by a sharp bell that echoed through the servant quarters at precisely 5 o'clock. I had barely slept, my mind racing with anxiety about what the day would bring, but I forced myself to rise quickly when I heard movement from the other bed. My roommate Mira was already pulling on her uniform, a simple gray dress with a white apron that marked us as household staff. She was a petite girl with auburn hair and kind eyes, though I could see the wariness that came from 2 years of service in this place. "First day?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. "Here," she said, pulling an identical uniform from the shared dresser. "Mrs. Hartwell had this sent up for you. The fit doesn't have to be perfect, but make sure you're clean and pressed. Alpha Donovan notices everything." As I changed into the uniform, Mira gave me a rapid overview of the daily routine. We start in the kitchens, helping prepare breakfast for the family and senior pack members. Then we move to cleaning duties. The main house has 37 rooms, and they all need to be maintained daily. Alpha Donovan's personal suite is cleaned by senior staff only, but you'll work your way up to that eventually. "What's he like?" I asked, dreading the answer. Mira paused in brushing her hair, her expression growing carefully neutral, powerful, demanding. "He expects perfection in everything, but if you do your job well and stay out of his way, he barely notices you exist. That's the safest place to be." We made our way through the maze of corridors to the kitchen, where I was introduced to the rest of the household staff. There were about 20 of us in total, mostly young women from various packs who had come to work for the Ironclad Pack for different reasons. Some, like me, were here to pay off family debts. Others had been sent by their alphas as part of political arrangements. A few had simply sought the security and steady pay that came with working for one of the most powerful packs in the region. The head cook, a matronly woman named Agnes, put me to work immediately chopping vegetables for the morning meal. The kitchen was a bustling hub of activity, with multiple conversations happening in hushed tones while everyone focused on their tasks. "Keep your head down and your mouth shut," advised Sarah, a girl who'd been working here for 3 years. "The Alpha doesn't like chatter during meal prep, and his hearing is better than most." As if summoned by her words, a change came over the kitchen. The casual conversations stopped abruptly, and everyone's posture straightened. I felt it too, a presence that seemed to fill the space, making the air itself feel heavier. The scent hit me a moment later, pine, leather, and something wild and untamed that made my wolf stir restlessly inside me. Alpha Donovan had entered the kitchen. I kept my eyes fixed on the carrots I was chopping, but I could feel him moving through the space, inspecting the meal preparation with the attention of a military commander reviewing troops. His footsteps were silent, but his presence was unmistakable, a force of nature contained in human form. "Mrs. Hartwell." His voice was deep, commanding, with an undertone that suggested he was accustomed to immediate obedience. "The new girl." "Yes, Alpha. Luna Blackthorne, as you requested." My hand stilled on the knife. He was talking about me, and every instinct told me I should look up, should acknowledge his attention. But Mira's warnings echoed in my mind, and I forced myself to remain focused on my task. "Look at me." The command was quiet, but it carried the full weight of Alpha authority. My head snapped up before I could stop myself, and for the first time I found myself looking directly at the man who now owned my life. Alpha Donovan was not what I had expected. I had imagined someone older, perhaps scarred from battles, with the kind of cruel features that matched his reputation. Instead, I found myself staring at a man who couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair and the kind of sharp, intelligent features that belonged in classical sculptures. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when they met mine, I felt a jolt of something I couldn't identify. He was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, all controlled power and dangerous grace. But it was his eyes that held me captive. They seemed to see straight through me, cataloging every detail, every weakness, every secret I thought I'd hidden. "You're younger than I expected," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "I'm 19, Alpha," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "And your wolf? Has she manifested?" The question surprised me. Most Alphas didn't concern themselves with the details of their servant's abilities. "Yes, Alpha. I had my first shift at 16. He nodded slowly, still studying me with that unnerving intensity. "Mrs. Hartwell will ensure you're properly trained. I expect excellence from everyone in my household, Miss Blackthorne. Do not disappoint me." "Yes, Alpha." He turned to leave, then paused. "Your father's debt has been cleared. You owe me 5 years of service, nothing more, nothing less. Serve well and you'll find me a fair employer, 'cause problems." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. After he left, the kitchen slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but I remained frozen, the knife still in my hand. Something had happened in that brief exchange, something I didn't understand but could feel in every cell of my body. My wolf was agitated, pacing restlessly beneath my skin, and I had the strangest urge to follow the Alpha's scent trail. "Luna." Mira's gentle touch on my arm brought me back to reality. "You're bleeding." I looked down to see that I'd gripped the knife so tightly that it had cut into my palm. The wound wasn't deep, but blood was dripping onto the cutting board. "I'm fine," I said quickly, wrapping my hand in a kitchen towel. But I wasn't fine. That brief encounter with Alpha Donovan had shaken something loose inside me, something I'd been keeping carefully controlled since arriving at the estate. As I cleaned and bandaged my hand, I tried to convince myself that what I'd felt was simply the natural response of a lower-ranked wolf to a powerful alpha. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of training and orientation. Mrs. Hartwell walked me through the main house, explaining the cleaning protocols and behavioral expectations. The Ironclad estate was even more impressive from the inside. Richly appointed rooms filled with artwork and furniture that probably cost more than my family's cabin, libraries with books in languages I'd never seen, and a formal dining room that could seat 50 people. "Alpha Donovan entertains frequently," Mrs. Hartwell explained as we toured the formal areas. "Business associates, other pack leaders, political figures. When there are guests, the staff must be invisible. You serve, you clean, you maintain, but you do not speak unless spoken to, and you certainly do not listen to private conversations." We ended the tour in Alpha Donovan's private wing, though we didn't enter his personal quarters. "This area is off-limits to junior staff," Mrs. Hartwell said firmly. "Only senior household members are permitted here, and only when specifically requested." As we walked past the closed doors of his suite, I caught another hint of his scent, and my wolf stirred again. There was something about his smell that called to something deep inside me, something primal and undeniable. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said carefully, "has Alpha Donovan found his mate?" She gave me a sharp look. "That is not a topic for household staff to discuss, Miss Blackthorne. I suggest you focus on your duties and leave the Alpha's personal life to those it concerns." The rebuke was clear, but I couldn't shake my curiosity. Something about Alpha Donovan felt significant, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The afternoon was spent learning the specific routines for maintaining the main house. Everything had to be done in a particular order, with particular products, to particular standards. The Ironclad Pack's wealth was evident in every detail, from the imported marble floors to the crystal chandeliers that required daily polishing. "The Alpha notices everything," Mira reminded me as we worked together in the main library. "A speck of dust on a bookshelf, a crooked picture frame, a water spot on a glass. He sees it all, and he doesn't tolerate sloppiness." "How do you stand it?" I asked. "The constant pressure? The fear of making a mistake?" Mira was quiet for a moment, carefully dusting a leather-bound volume. "You learn to find small freedoms," she said finally. "A moment of sunshine in the garden, a good book borrowed from the library, a kind word from another staff member. And you remember that this isn't forever. I have 8 months left on my contract, and then I'll have enough saved to start my own life somewhere else. Do you ever think about leaving early? Just running? Every day for the first 6 months. Mira admitted. But where would I go? My pack sold me here just like yours sold you. And Alpha Donovan has connections everywhere. Runaway servants don't get very far, and the punishment for breaking contract? She shuddered. It's not worth the risk. As the day wore on, I began to understand the rhythm of life in the Ironclad household. Everything revolved around Alpha Donovan's schedule and preferences. When he was in residence, the entire house operated with military precision. When he traveled on business, the atmosphere relaxed slightly, but the standards never dropped. Dinner in the servants' hall was a simple affair. Hearty food served efficiently while everyone discussed the day's work and tomorrow's tasks. I learned that Alpha Donovan would be hosting a dinner party the following week for several neighboring pack leaders, which meant extra preparations and heightened expectations for all staff. The Alpha's dinner parties are legendary, explained Thomas, one of the footmen. He uses them to conduct business, form alliances, settle disputes. The food has to be perfect, the service flawless, and the atmosphere exactly right. It's a lot of pressure, but it's also when we see the Alpha at his most impressive. Impressive how? I asked. You'll see, Thomas said with a knowing smile. Alpha Donovan isn't just powerful, he's brilliant. Watching him navigate pack politics is like watching a master chess player. He's always thinking 3 moves ahead. That night, as I lay in my narrow bed listening to Mira's quiet breathing, I found myself thinking about my brief encounter with Alpha Donovan. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at me, something that went beyond the usual assessment of a new servant. It had felt almost like recognition, though that was impossible. We'd never met before today. I touched my mother's pendant, which I wore hidden beneath my uniform, and wondered what she would think of my situation. She had always told me that the moon goddess had a plan for everyone, that even the darkest moments served a purpose in the greater design of our lives. Maybe this is part of my path, I whispered to the darkness. Maybe I'm supposed to be here. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that my presence in the Ironclad Pack house was going to change things in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The Alpha's scent still lingered in my memory, and my wolf was restless with an energy I didn't understand. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of storm gray eyes and a voice that commanded obedience with effortless authority. In my dream, Alpha Donovan wasn't my employer. He was something else entirely, something that made my heart race and my wolf howl with longing. I woke with a start, my cheeks burning with embarrassment at the direction my subconscious had taken. Whatever was happening to me, I needed to get it under control. I was here to serve a contract, nothing more. I couldn't afford to develop inappropriate feelings for the Alpha who owned my life. But as I prepared for my second day in the Ironclad household, I couldn't shake the feeling that my fate was already sealed, and that Alpha Donovan was going to play a much larger role in my future than either of us currently realized. 3 weeks into my service at the Ironclad estate, I had settled into the demanding routine of household work. My hands had grown calloused from scrubbing floors and polishing silver, and I had learned to move through the mansion's corridors with the silent efficiency expected of all staff. But despite my best efforts to remain invisible, I found myself increasingly aware of Alpha Donovan's presence whenever he was in the house. It wasn't just his commanding aura, or the way other wolves instinctively deferred to him. There was something else, something that made my wolf restless and alert whenever he was near. I had begun to notice patterns in his behavior, how he always paused outside the library when I was working there, how his eyes seemed to find me during the brief moments when our paths crossed in the corridors. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was in the main library, carefully dusting the extensive collection of books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The library was one of my favorite assignments because it was usually quiet, and Alpha Donovan rarely used it during the day. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere that reminded me of lazy afternoons reading in my childhood home. I was balanced on a ladder, reaching for a particularly high shelf, when I heard the library door open. The familiar scent of pine and leather filled the air, and my wolf immediately went on alert. I didn't need to look to know that Alpha Donovan had entered the room. "Continue with your work," his deep voice commanded when I started to climb down. "I'm just retrieving some documents." I forced myself to focus on the books in front of me, but I was acutely aware of his movements as he walked to the large desk near the windows. I could hear him shuffling through papers, occasionally making quiet sounds of satisfaction or frustration as he searched for whatever he needed. "Miss Blackthorne," he said suddenly, and I nearly dropped the book I was holding. "Yes, Alpha. How long have you been working in the library?" The question seemed oddly personal, but I answered honestly. "About 2 weeks, Alpha. Mrs. Hartwell assigned me here after I finished training in the other areas of the house." "And you enjoy it?" I paused, uncertain how to respond. Was this a test? Was he checking to see if I was satisfied with my assigned duties, or was he looking for a reason to reassign me to less pleasant work? "Yes, Alpha," I said carefully. I've always enjoyed reading, and the library is peaceful. What do you like to read? The question was so unexpected that I turned to look at him, forgetting Mrs. Hartwell's instructions about maintaining focus on my work. Alpha Donovan was leaning against the desk, his storm gray eyes fixed on me with genuine curiosity. History, mostly, I admitted. Stories about the old packs, the wars between territories, the legends about the first shifters. My mother used to tell me stories about the moon goddess and the ancient alphas who could speak directly with her. Something flickered in his eyes at the mention of my mother. Your mother was a storyteller? She knew all the old tales, I said, climbing down from the ladder since it was clear he wanted to have a conversation. She said her grandmother had been a keeper of pack history before the territories were reorganized. Most of the stories were passed down orally, never written down. Alpha Donovan straightened, his attention now completely focused on me. What kind of stories? I hesitated, uncertain why he was so interested. Stories about mates chosen by the moon goddess herself, about alphas who could sense their destined partners across great distances, about bonds so strong they could transcend death itself. I felt my cheeks warm as I spoke. I know they're just legends, but my mother believed they were based on truth. They are based on truth, Alpha Donovan said quietly, and something in his tone made my heart skip a beat. The old ways, the original bonds between mates, they were far more powerful than what most modern wolves experience. He moved closer, and I found myself backing up against the bookshelf. Not because I was afraid, but because his proximity was doing strange things to my ability to think clearly. Tell me, Luna, he said, using my first name for the first time since I'd arrived. Have you ever felt a pull towards someone? A connection that defied explanation? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to face. My wolf was practically vibrating with excitement, pressing against my consciousness with an urgency I'd never experienced before. I started to speak, but the words died in my throat as Alpha Donovan reached out and gently touched my cheek. The moment his skin made contact with mine, the world exploded into sensation. It was as if every nerve ending in my body had suddenly come alive, sending waves of warmth and electricity through my system. My wolf let out a howl of recognition that echoed through my mind, and I saw my own shock reflected in Alpha Donovan's eyes. Mate, he whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of destiny. I staggered backward, my hand flying to my cheek where his touch still burned like a brand. No, I said, shaking my head frantically. That's impossible. I'm just a servant. You're an alpha. The moon goddess doesn't care about social status, Alpha Donovan said, his voice rough with emotion. She pairs souls, not ranks. But even as he said it, I could see the conflict in his eyes. The same shock and recognition I was feeling was warring with something else. Duty, perhaps, or the expectations that came with his position. This can't be happening, I said, pressing my back against the bookshelf as if I could somehow disappear into it. My father sold me here to pay his debts. You own my contract. This is all wrong. Alpha Donovan ran a hand through his dark hair, his composure cracking for the first time since I'd known him. Luna, I need you to listen to me. What just happened, what we both felt, it's real. You're my mate. The moon goddess has chosen you for me. But I'm nobody, I protested. I'm from the lowest tier of my pack. I have no education, no training, no... You have everything that matters, he interrupted, stepping closer again. You have strength, intelligence, and a spirit that hasn't been broken despite everything you've endured. Do you think I haven't been watching you these past weeks? Do you think I haven't noticed how you care for the other staff members? How you work with dedication even though you're here against your will? I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You've been watching me? A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. From the moment you arrived, I've been drawn to you in ways I couldn't explain. Your scent, your presence. My wolf has been restless every day since you walked into my house. That's why you came to the kitchen that first morning, I realized. You wanted to see me. I told myself I was just checking on the new staff member, he admitted. But the truth is I couldn't stay away. And now I know why. The implications of his words were staggering. If what he was saying was true, if we really were mates chosen by the moon goddess, then everything about my situation had just changed dramatically. But it also raised a dozen new problems. What happens now? I asked quietly. Alpha Donovan's expression grew serious. That's complicated. As my mate, you would normally be elevated to the position of Luna of the pack, but your current status as a contracted servant creates difficulties. What kind of difficulties? Political ones. I have enemies who would use this situation against me. They would claim I'm taking advantage of a servant, that I'm abusing my power. Some might even suggest that the mate bond isn't real, that I'm simply indulging in a fantasy. I felt my heart sink. Of course there would be obstacles. Nothing in my life had ever been simple, so why should finding my destined mate be any different? There's also the matter of your contract, Alpha Donovan continued. Legally, you belong to me for the next 4 years and 9 months. I can't simply release you without raising questions about why I'm showing favoritism to one particular servant. So what are you saying? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. I'm saying we need to be careful. We need to find a way to navigate this situation without putting either of us at risk. He paused, studying my face. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to explore this bond between us, even if it means keeping it secret for now? I thought about my options. I could deny the mate bond, try to convince myself that what I'd felt was just attraction or imagination. I could serve out my contract in silence and leave when it was finished, never knowing what might have been. Or I could take a leap of faith and trust in the moon goddess's plan, even if I couldn't see where it would lead. Yes, I said finally. I want to understand what this means. I want to explore the bond. Relief flooded Alpha Donovan's features. Then we'll figure this out together. But Luna, you must understand. This has to remain between us for now. If word gets out before we're ready, it could be dangerous for both of us. I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. What do we do? We continue as we have been, at least outwardly. You'll keep working as a member of the household staff, and I'll maintain my role as Alpha. But we'll find ways to spend time together, to learn about each other, to let the bond develop naturally. And if someone notices, if they start asking questions, Alpha Donovan's expression hardened slightly. Let me worry about that. My primary concern is keeping you safe while we figure out how to handle this situation properly. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made us both freeze. Alpha Donovan quickly stepped away from me, returning to his position behind the desk, while I grabbed my cleaning supplies and tried to look busy. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. Alpha Donovan, I apologize for the interruption. I was looking for Miss Blackthorne. She's needed in the kitchen to help with lunch preparations. Of course, Alpha Donovan said smoothly, his voice betraying nothing of our conversation. Miss Blackthorne was just finishing up in here. I gathered my supplies quickly, avoiding eye contact with both of them. But as I passed Alpha Donovan's desk, he spoke quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. We'll continue this conversation later. The promise in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. As I followed Mrs. Hartwell out of the library, I could feel his eyes on me, and my wolf was practically purring with satisfaction. Everything had changed in the span of a single conversation. I was no longer just a servant working off her family's debt. I was the destined mate of one of the most powerful alphas in the region, chosen by the moon goddess herself for a purpose I was only beginning to understand. But with that revelation came new dangers and complications that I couldn't yet foresee. As I returned to my duties in the kitchen, my mind raced with questions about what the future would hold. How long could we keep our bond secret? What would happen when it was finally revealed? And most importantly, was I strong enough to handle whatever challenges lay ahead? One thing was certain, my life had just become infinitely more complicated, and there was no going back to the simple existence I'd known before. The moon goddess had set me on a new path, and I could only hope I was brave enough to follow it wherever it might lead. The days following my revelation with Alpha Donovan passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and electric tension. On the surface, nothing had changed. I continued my duties as a household servant, maintaining the careful invisibility that Mrs. Hartwell demanded of all staff. But underneath, everything was different. I was hyper-aware of Alpha Donovan's presence in the house, could sense when he was near even before his scent reached me, and found myself looking for excuses to be in areas where our paths might cross. He was being careful, I realized. Our interactions remained professional and brief when others were around, but I began to notice subtle signs that he was thinking about me. A lingering glance when he thought no one was looking. A slight pause when he passed me in the corridors. The way his voice softened almost imperceptibly when he addressed me directly. It was Mira who first noticed my distraction. "You've been different lately," she said one evening as we prepared for bed. "Happier, but also, I don't know, more alert? Like you're waiting for something." I forced myself to focus on braiding my hair, trying to keep my expression neutral. "I'm just getting used to the routine here. It's not as terrible as I expected." Mira said, but she didn't push the subject. I was grateful for her discretion, but I also felt guilty about keeping such a monumental secret from the one person who had become my friend in this place. The opportunity for Alpha Donovan and me to have a private conversation came 3 days later, when Mrs. Hartwell assigned me to dust the Alpha's private study while he was supposedly away on pack business. I had been working for about an hour when I heard the door open behind me. "Don't turn around," Alpha Donovan's voice said quietly, "in case someone is watching the corridors." I continued polishing the wooden surface of his desk, but my heart rate increased dramatically. I thought you were away until tomorrow. I returned early. I've been thinking about our conversation in the library, about what it means for both of us. He moved closer and I could feel the warmth of his body behind me. Luna, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What is it? Do you feel the bond? Not just the physical attraction, but the deeper connection? The sense that we're meant to be together? I set down the polishing cloth and finally turned to face him. He was standing closer than I'd expected, close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Yes, I said simply. I feel it. It's like there's a string connecting us, pulling me toward you even when I try to resist it. Relief flooded his features. Good. I was afraid that maybe I was imagining it, that my wolf was influencing my judgment. Your wolf? He's been restless since you arrived, constantly pushing me to seek you out, to claim you, to make our bond official. Alpha Donovan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of his frustration. It's taking all my self-control to maintain the pretense that you're just another servant. The word claim sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with fear. My own wolf had been equally restless, yearning for something I hadn't fully understood until now. What would it mean? I asked. If we made the bond official, everything would change, he said seriously. You would become my Luna, the female alpha of this pack. You would have authority over every wolf here, second only to me. You would be my partner in all things, pack business, political decisions, territorial disputes. The magnitude of what he was describing was overwhelming. I don't know anything about being a Luna. I've never even held a position of authority in my own pack. You would learn, Alpha Donovan said with confidence. Leadership isn't about what you know. It's about who you are. And you, Luna Blackthorne, have the strength and intelligence to be an exceptional Luna. How can you be so sure? Because I've been watching you, he said, moving even closer. I've seen how you handle difficult situations, how you care for others even when you're struggling yourself. Yesterday, when that new girl Sarah was having trouble with her duties, you stayed late to help her even though you were exhausted. When Thomas injured his hand in the kitchen, you were the first to offer assistance. You have a natural instinct to protect and nurture others. That's the mark of a true leader. I felt my cheeks warm at his praise. Those were just small things. Small things reveal character, he said firmly. And your character is exactly what this pack needs in a Luna. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of possibility hanging between us. Then Alpha Donovan reached out and gently took my hand, being careful not to touch my skin directly. I want to court you properly, he said. I want to give you the chance to know me as more than just the alpha who owns your contract. Will you let me do that? How? I asked. We can't exactly go on public dates. A small smile tugged at his lips. Leave that to me. Meet me in the garden tonight after the household retires. There's a gazebo near the rose garden. Do you know it? I nodded. I had seen the small structure during my brief breaks outside, though I had never approached it. Midnight, he said. Can you get away without being noticed? I think so. Mira sleeps deeply, and the night guards patrol the perimeter, not the interior grounds. Good. He squeezed my hand gently, then released it. Luna, I want you to understand something. Whatever happens between us, whatever we decide about our future, I will never use your contract to force you into anything. If you decide you don't want to pursue this bond, I'll respect that decision. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside me. Thank you, I said softly. That means more to me than you know. After he left, I finished my cleaning duties in a daze, my mind spinning with anticipation and nervousness about our planned meeting. The rest of the day passed with agonizing slowness, but finally, the household settled into its nighttime quiet. I waited until I was certain Mira was deeply asleep before slipping out of our room. The corridors were dimly lit by moonlight streaming through the windows, and I made my way carefully toward the garden entrance. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear it, but I encountered no one on my way outside. The garden at night was transformed into something magical. Moonlight silvered the leaves and flowers, creating deep shadows and mysterious pools of light. The scent of roses and jasmine filled the air, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the gentle sound of a fountain. I found the gazebo easily. It was a small, elegant structure surrounded by climbing roses that filled the air with their perfume. Alpha Donovan was already there, waiting for me in the shadows. You came, he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Did you think I wouldn't? I wasn't sure. This is all very unconventional, and I know it puts you in a difficult position. I stepped into the gazebo, and he moved to make room for me on the small bench inside. We sat carefully apart, not touching but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Tell me about yourself, he said. Not the facts I read in your file, but the real you. What do you dream about? What makes you happy? What are you afraid of? The questions were so different from what I had expected that I found myself answering honestly. I told him about my childhood, about the stories my mother used to tell, about my dreams of traveling beyond the Pack territories to see the world. I shared my fears about my brother Tommy, about whether my father was taking proper care of him, about what would happen to me when my contract ended. In return, Alpha Donovan told me about his own life, the pressure of inheriting the Alpha position at a young age when his father died unexpectedly, the loneliness of leadership, the weight of responsibility for hundreds of Pack members. He spoke about his own dreams, his vision for making the Ironclad Pack a place where all wolves could thrive regardless of their birth rank. I never expected to find my mate this way, he admitted as the night grew deeper. I always assumed it would be someone from another Alpha family, someone chosen for political advantage. Are you disappointed? I asked quietly. Disappointed? He turned to look at me, his eyes intense in the moonlight. Luna, you're everything I never knew I wanted. You're strong without being harsh, kind without being weak, intelligent without being arrogant. The moon goddess chose perfectly. His words sent warmth flooding through me, but they also raised a practical concern. What about your Pack? What will they think when they find out their Alpha's mate is a servant? Some will have concerns initially, he admitted, but once they see your strength, once they understand that you're truly my destined mate, they'll accept you. The moon goddess's choices are not questioned lightly. We talked until the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, sharing stories and dreams and fears. When it was time for me to return to the house, Alpha Donovan walked me to the garden entrance. Can we do this again? He asked. Tomorrow night? Yes, I said without hesitation. I'd like that. He reached out as if to touch my face, then stopped himself. Soon, he said quietly. Soon we won't have to hide. I returned to my room just as Mira was beginning to stir, slipping into bed and pretending to sleep until the morning bell rang. But I was far too excited to rest, my mind replaying every moment of our conversation. Over the following weeks, our midnight meetings in the garden became a treasured routine. We talked about everything: Pack politics, literature, our hopes for the future, our fears about the challenges ahead. Alpha Donovan was nothing like the cold, ruthless leader I had expected. He was thoughtful, funny, surprisingly gentle, and deeply committed to the welfare of his Pack. I began to understand why he was so respected as a leader. He didn't rule through fear or intimidation, but through earned loyalty and genuine care for his people. He knew the names of every Pack member, their families, their struggles and successes. He was the kind of Alpha who inspired devotion rather than demanding it. And with each passing night, the bond between us grew stronger. We still hadn't touched, both of us understanding instinctively that physical contact would intensify the mate bond beyond our ability to hide it. But the emotional connection was becoming undeniable. It was during our 4th week of secret meetings that everything began to unravel. I was returning from the garden one morning when I encountered Mrs. Hartwell in the corridor outside my room. She was standing with her arms crossed, her expression stern and knowing. Miss Blackthorne, she said quietly, I think we need to have a conversation. My blood ran cold. Had she seen me leaving the house? Did she know about my meetings with Alpha Donovan? Of course, Mrs. Hartwell, I managed to say. Is there a problem with my work? Not with your work, no, but there are other concerns that need to be addressed. Come with me. She led me to her private office, a small room near the kitchen that served as her administrative headquarters. Once the door was closed, she turned to face me with an expression I couldn't read. Miss Blackthorne, in my 30 years of managing this household, I have learned to notice things that others might miss. Changes in behavior, unusual patterns, signs that something is not quite as it appears. I remained silent, not trusting my voice. You have been different these past weeks, she continued, happier, more confident, but also more secretive. And Alpha Donovan? She paused, studying my face. Alpha Donovan has been asking questions about you. Your background, your family, your education. That is not typical behavior for him regarding household staff. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure she could hear it. I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Hartwell. I think you do, she said gently. And I think you're both playing a very dangerous game. The kindness in her voice surprised me. I had expected anger, threats, perhaps even immediate dismissal. Instead, she seemed almost concerned. Mrs. Hartwell, You don't need to explain anything to me, she interrupted. But you do need to understand the position you're in. If certain people in this pack discover what I suspect is happening, it could be disastrous for both of you. What do you mean? Mrs. Hartwell moved to her desk and pulled out a folder. Alpha Donovan has enemies, Miss Blackthorne. Wolves who would love nothing more than to see him brought down. If they learned that he was involved with a servant, someone bound to him by contract, she shook her head. They would use it to destroy him. The full implications of what she was saying hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on the wonder of finding my mate that I hadn't fully considered the political ramifications. "What should we do?" I asked quietly. Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You really care about him, don't you? This isn't just about improving your situation or gaining power." "I love him," I said simply, the words coming out before I could stop them. It was the first time I had admitted it, even to myself, but I knew it was true. "Then you need to be very, very careful," Mrs. Hartwell said, "because love alone won't protect either of you from the consequences of this situation." As I left her office and returned to my duties, her warning echoed in my mind. I had found my destined mate, but I was beginning to realize that claiming him might require more courage and sacrifice than I had ever imagined. That evening, I waited anxiously for midnight, needing to share Mrs. Hartwell's warning with Alpha Donovan. But when I arrived at the gazebo, I found it empty. I waited for over an hour, but he never came. The next morning brought troubling news that explained his absence. Beta Morrison announced to the household staff that Alpha Donovan had been called away on urgent pack business, a territorial dispute with a neighboring pack that required his immediate attention. He would be gone for at least a week, possibly longer. As I went through the motions of my daily duties, I couldn't shake the feeling that his sudden departure was more than coincidence. Mrs. Hartwell's warning had made me realize just how precarious our situation really was, and now I was left alone to worry about what dangers might be gathering while he was away. It was during his absence that I began to notice the subtle changes in how some of the pack members treated me. Nothing overt. A slightly longer stare from one of the guards. A whispered conversation that stopped when I entered a room. The way certain pack members seemed to be watching me more closely than before. Someone suspected something. And if Mrs. Hartwell was right about Alpha Donovan having enemies, then our secret meetings might have already been discovered. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Mira's peaceful breathing, I realized that the fairy tale romance I had been living was about to face its first real test. The question was whether our bond would be strong enough to survive the storm that was coming. Alpha Donovan's absence stretched into 2 weeks, and with each passing day, I felt the weight of suspicious eyes upon me growing heavier. The pack members' behavior had shifted from subtle observation to barely concealed hostility, and I began to understand that our secret had not been as well kept as we had believed. It was during the 3rd week of his absence that everything came to a head. I was working in the main dining room, polishing the long mahogany table that could seat 30 pack members, when Beta Morrison entered with 2 other high-ranking wolves I recognized, but had never spoken to directly. Their expressions were grim, and the way they positioned themselves around the room made it clear this was not a casual visit. "Miss Blackthorne," Beta Morrison said, his voice carrying an authority that made my wolf instinctively want to submit. "Please stop what you're doing and face us." I set down my polishing cloth and turned to face them, keeping my expression as neutral as possible despite the fear coursing through my veins. "Yes, Beta Morrison, we need to discuss your relationship with Alpha Donovan." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I had known this moment would come eventually, but I still wasn't prepared for the reality of it. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said carefully. "Alpha Donovan is my employer. I serve in his household according to the terms of my contract." Beta Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "Miss Blackthorne, we know about your midnight meetings in the garden. We know about the private conversations in his study. We know that Alpha Donovan has been showing you favoritism that goes far beyond what would be appropriate for a servant." My heart sank. They had been watching us, probably from the very beginning. All our careful precautions had been useless. "What do you want?" I asked, abandoning any pretense of ignorance. "We want the truth," said the wolf to Morrison's left, a man I knew to be Gamma Stevens, one of the pack's senior advisors. "Are you claiming to be Alpha Donovan's mate?" The question was a trap, and I knew it. If I admitted the truth, they would use it against both of us. If I denied it, I would be lying about something sacred, something chosen by the moon goddess herself. "I am whatever Alpha Donovan says I am," I replied carefully. "That's not an answer," Morrison said sharply. "The pack has a right to know if their alpha is being influenced by inappropriate attachments. If he's making decisions based on infatuation rather than logic. Alpha Donovan's decisions are his own," I said firmly. "I have never tried to influence him in any way. Haven't you?" The 3rd wolf, Delta Marcus, stepped forward. "Isn't it convenient that a servant girl from a debt-ridden family suddenly catches the alpha's attention? Some might say you've been using your position to seduce him for your own gain." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "That's not true. I never—" "Then explain the gifts," Morrison interrupted, producing a small velvet box from his jacket. This was found in your room during a routine inspection. He opened the box to reveal a delicate silver bracelet set with small sapphires. I had never seen it before in my life, but I could tell from their expressions that they believed it was evidence of Alpha Donovan's favoritism. I've never seen that before, I said honestly. It's not mine. Really? Morrison's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Then how did it end up hidden in your dresser drawer? The realization hit me like a cold wave. They had planted it there. This entire confrontation was orchestrated, designed to create evidence of impropriety whether it existed or not. You put it there, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. That's a serious accusation, Miss Blackthorne, Gamma Stevens said. Are you suggesting that Pack leadership would fabricate evidence? I'm suggesting that some members of Pack leadership might have their own agenda, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Morrison's expression hardened, and I realized I had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Miss Blackthorne, Morrison said slowly, you are contracted to serve this pack for the next 4 years. During that time, you will conduct yourself with appropriate deference to your betters. You will not spread rumors or make accusations against pack leadership. And you will cease any inappropriate contact with Alpha Donovan immediately. And if I refuse, then your contract will be transferred to another pack, Delta Marcus said with obvious satisfaction. One where your talents might be put to different use. The threat was clear. There were packs that used contracted servants for purposes far worse than household work. I would disappear into a system where I had no protection and no hope of escape. You can't do that, I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true. My contract is with Alpha Donovan specifically. Alpha Donovan delegated authority over household staff to pack leadership, Morrison replied smoothly. We have full discretion over your assignment and treatment. I felt trapped, cornered by wolves who clearly had their own reasons for wanting to separate me from Alpha Donovan. But I also felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Why? I asked. Why are you so determined to keep us apart? What are you afraid of? The three wolves exchanged glances, and I saw something flicker in Morrison's eyes, something that looked almost like fear. We're afraid of nothing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We're simply protecting our Alpha from making a mistake that could damage his reputation and the pack's standing. Or you're protecting your own positions, I said, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. You're afraid that if Alpha Donovan takes a mate, especially one who wasn't chosen by you, your influence over him will diminish. The silence that followed my words was deafening. I had hit closer to the truth than they were comfortable with. You have 24 hours to decide, Morrison said finally. Cease all contact with Alpha Donovan and accept your place as a servant, or face the consequences of your defiance. They left me alone in the dining room, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. I was being forced to choose between my mate and my safety, between love and survival. But as I stood there among the polished furniture and crystal chandeliers that represented the wealth and power of the Ironclad Pack, I realized something important. I was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold by her family 3 months ago. The time I had spent here, the bond I had formed with Alpha Donovan, the confidence I had gained, it had all changed me. I was still afraid, but I was no longer powerless. That evening, I sought out Mrs. Hartwell in her office. She looked up from her paperwork as I entered, and I could see in her expression that she already knew what had happened. They came to see you today, she said. It wasn't a question. They want me to end my relationship with Alpha Donovan, I said, sitting down across from her desk. They're threatening to transfer my contract if I don't comply. Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. And what do you intend to do? I need to know something first, I said. How much authority do they actually have over my contract? Can they really transfer me without Alpha Donovan's approval? Legally? No, Mrs. Hartwell said carefully. Your contract is specifically with Alpha Donovan. But practically speaking, if they can convince him that you're a threat to pack stability, they could manipulate him into agreeing to the transfer, I finished. It's possible, especially if they present evidence that makes it look like you've been using your position inappropriately. I thought about the planted bracelet, about the way they had twisted our innocent meetings into something sordid and manipulative. Mrs. Hartwell, I said slowly, what do you know about Beta Morrison's history with Alpha Donovan? Her expression grew guarded. What do you mean? I mean, has he always been loyal? Has he ever had reason to want Alpha Donovan weakened or removed? Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for so long that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Beta Morrison was in line to inherit leadership of his birth pack before Alpha Donovan's father formed an alliance that absorbed Morrison's territory into the Ironclad Pack. Morrison was given the Beta position as part of the agreement, but he never forgot that he was supposed to be an Alpha himself. I said, understanding flooding through me. You didn't hear that from me, Mrs. Hartwell said firmly. But yes, there have always been questions about Morrison's ultimate loyalty. He's never done anything overtly treasonous, but he's also never missed an opportunity to undermine Alpha Donovan's authority when he could do so subtly. The pieces were falling into place. Morrison wasn't just trying to protect the pack from an inappropriate relationship. He was trying to create a scandal that would damage Alpha Donovan's reputation and potentially his position. What would happen if Alpha Donovan were removed as Alpha? I asked. The pack council would choose a new leader. And as Beta, Morrison would be the most likely candidate. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was about much more than my relationship with Alpha Donovan. This was about a power grab that had been years in the making. Mrs. Hartwell, I need to get a message to Alpha Donovan. Can you help me? She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What do you want to tell him? Tell him that his Beta is planning a coup, and that I'm the excuse he's been waiting for. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing that I had just set events in motion that would change everything. Alpha Donovan would return to find his pack in turmoil, his authority challenged, and his mate at the center of a political storm. But I also knew that I had made the right choice. The moon goddess had brought us together for a reason, and I wasn't going to let ambitious wolves destroy what she had created. The next morning brought news that Alpha Donovan was returning earlier than expected. Beta Morrison announced to the household staff that the Alpha would arrive that afternoon, and that there would be an important pack meeting that evening. I could see the satisfaction in Morrison's eyes as he made the announcement. He thought he had won, that he had successfully maneuvered Alpha Donovan into a position where he would have to choose between his mate and his pack. But Morrison had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated both Alpha Donovan's intelligence and my determination to fight for what was mine. As I prepared for what I knew would be the most important day of my life, I touched my mother's pendant and whispered a prayer to the moon goddess for strength. The battle for my future and Alpha Donovan's was about to begin. The afternoon of Alpha Donovan's return was thick with tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the estate. I could feel it in the way the other servants moved through their duties with nervous energy, in the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, and in the satisfied smirks of Beta Morrison and his allies as they prepared for what they clearly believed would be their moment of triumph. I had spent the morning in a state of anxious anticipation, alternating between hope that Mrs. Hartwell had successfully delivered my message and fear that Alpha Donovan would arrive unprepared for the trap that had been set for him. When the sound of vehicles finally echoed through the estate grounds, my heart began racing with a mixture of relief and terror. From my position in the main hall, where I was polishing the marble floors, I could see Alpha Donovan's arrival through the tall windows. He emerged from the lead vehicle with his usual commanding presence, but I could detect subtle signs of tension in his posture that others might miss. His jaw was set in a hard line, his movements were more controlled than usual, and his eyes swept the assembled pack members with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential threats. Beta Morrison stepped forward to greet him, flanked by Gamma Stevens and Delta Marcus. The formal nature of their reception was unusual. Typically, Alpha Donovan's returns from business trips were more casual affairs. Alpha? Morrison said with a respectful bow that somehow managed to convey condescension. Welcome home. I trust your business was concluded successfully? It was, Alpha Donovan replied, his voice giving nothing away. I understand there are matters here that require my immediate attention. Indeed, we've discovered some irregularities that need to be addressed before they become more serious problems. I forced myself to continue my cleaning, but every muscle in my body was tense as I listened to their exchange. Alpha Donovan's gaze swept the hall, and for just a moment, his eyes met mine. The look that passed between us was brief but intense. He knew what was coming, and he was ready for it. Very well, Alpha Donovan said. We'll convene the Pack Council in 1 hour. I want all senior members present. As the group moved toward Alpha Donovan's private study, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Hartwell near the kitchen entrance. She gave me the slightest nod, confirming that she had delivered my message. Whatever happened next, at least Alpha Donovan wouldn't be walking into this blindly. The hour that followed was the longest of my life. I tried to focus on my duties, but my mind kept racing through possible scenarios. Would Alpha Donovan be forced to choose between me and his pack? Would Morrison succeed in painting our relationship as something sordid and manipulative? Would I be transferred to another pack before the day was over? When the time came for the Pack Council meeting, I positioned myself in the servants' corridor that ran behind the main conference room. The walls were thin enough that I could hear most of what was said, and I needed to know how this confrontation would unfold. The meeting began with Morrison presenting his case against me. His voice carried clearly through the wall as he detailed the evidence of my inappropriate relationship with Alpha Donovan. The midnight meetings, the private conversations, the planted bracelet that he claimed proved I was receiving gifts in exchange for sexual favors. This servant has clearly been manipulating our alpha, Morrison concluded, using her position and his natural protective instincts to gain influence over him. If we allow this to continue, it will undermine his authority and damage the pack's reputation. There were murmurs of agreement from some pack members, but I also heard voices of dissent. Not everyone was convinced by Morrison's presentation. "What evidence do you have that Alpha Donovan's judgment has been compromised?" asked a voice I recognized as belonging to Gamma Rodriguez, one of the pack's senior warriors. "His recent decisions have been questionable," Morrison replied smoothly. "The new training protocols, the changes to pack hierarchy, the increased resources allocated to lower-ranked members. These are not the actions of an alpha thinking clearly." I felt a surge of anger at his words. The changes Morrison was criticizing were exactly the kind of progressive policies that made Alpha Donovan such an effective leader. He was being attacked for caring about all members of his pack, not just the elite. "Those policies have improved pack morale and efficiency," Rodriguez countered. "I fail to see how they represent poor judgment. Because they prioritize sentiment over strength," Morrison shot back. "An alpha who can be influenced by a servant girl is an alpha who can be manipulated by enemies." That was when Alpha Donovan finally spoke, his voice cutting through the debate like a blade. "Beta Morrison," he said, and the formal use of Morrison's title carried a weight of authority that silenced the room. "You speak of manipulation and influence as if you have personal knowledge of such things. Perhaps you'd like to explain how you came to be such an expert on the subject?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Morrison had been expecting to control this conversation, but Alpha Donovan was taking charge. "I'm simply concerned for the pack's welfare," Morrison replied, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Are you? Then perhaps you can explain why you've been meeting secretly with representatives from the Shadowmere Pack, or why you've been spreading rumors about my leadership among the neighboring territories." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison had been caught completely off guard. "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't you?" Alpha Donovan's voice was deadly quiet now. "Gamma Rodriguez, would you please share with the council what your contacts in the Shadowmere Pack told you about Beta Morrison's recent visits?" Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Alpha Morrison has been in communication with Alpha Blackwood of the Shadowmere Pack, discussing potential changes in regional leadership. He's been suggesting that the Ironclad Pack might be open to new alliances if the current leadership were to change." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Morrison had been caught in an act of treason, planning to overthrow Alpha Donovan and align the pack with their traditional enemies. That's not what those meetings were about," Morrison stammered. "I was gathering intelligence, trying to understand their intentions. By offering to deliver the Ironclad Pack to them," Alpha Donovan's voice was like ice. "By suggesting that I was weak and could be easily removed?" I pressed closer to the wall, hardly daring to breathe as the confrontation escalated. "You have no proof of that," Morrison said desperately. "Actually, I do." Alpha Donovan's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "You see, Beta Morrison, Alpha Blackwood, and I have been in communication for months. He's been keeping me informed of your treasonous proposals in exchange for certain territorial concessions." The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Morrison had been played, his own machinations turned against him by an alpha who was far more cunning than he had realized. "This is about the girl," Morrison said, his voice rising with desperation. "You're protecting her because she's bewitched you somehow. Can't you see that she's the real threat here?" "Miss Blackthorne is not the threat," Alpha Donovan said firmly. "You are, and your attempts to use her as a weapon against me only confirm your guilt." "She's just a servant," Morrison shouted. "A nobody from a debt-ridden family. She has no business influencing pack decisions. She's my mate." The words rang out with absolute authority, silencing every voice in the room. Alpha Donovan had just publicly acknowledged our bond, claiming me before the entire pack council. "That's impossible," Morrison said weakly. "She's not of alpha blood. The moon goddess chooses as she wills," Alpha Donovan interrupted. "And she has chosen Luna Blackthorne as my mate and your future Luna. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to challenge me for leadership." The challenge was clear and unmistakable. Morrison could either accept Alpha Donovan's authority or face him in combat for the right to lead the pack. I held my breath, waiting for Morrison's response. A formal challenge would mean a fight to the death, with the winner taking control of the pack. It was an ancient law that no wolf could refuse. Morrison's voice was barely audible. "I withdraw my concerns about Miss Blackthorne," The capitulation was complete. Morrison had been outmaneuvered, exposed, and defeated without Alpha Donovan having to shed a drop of blood. Good, Alpha Donovan said. Now, as for your future with this pack, I'll leave, Morrison said quickly. Tonight, I'll take exile rather than face trial for treason. That would be wise, Alpha Donovan agreed. You have until dawn to be off Ironclad territory. If you're found here after sunrise, you'll be treated as an enemy combatant. I heard chairs scraping and footsteps as the meeting began to break up. My legs felt weak with relief and shock. It was over. Morrison's plot had failed. Alpha Donovan had publicly claimed me as his mate, and I was no longer just a servant. But even as relief flooded through me, I realized that my real challenges were just beginning. Being acknowledged as Alpha Donovan's mate was only the first step. Now I would have to prove myself worthy of the title of Luna, worthy of the respect and loyalty of a pack that had just learned their future leader was a former servant. I made my way back to my room, my mind spinning with the implications of what had just happened. When I arrived, I found Mira waiting for me, her eyes wide with excitement and concern. Luna, she said, using my name with new reverence. Is it true? Are you really going to be our Luna? I sat down on my bed, still trying to process everything. It seems so. I can't believe it, Mira said, shaking her head in amazement. A few months ago, you were sold here to pay your father's debts, and now you're going to be the most powerful female in the pack. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been brought here as property, and now I was being elevated to a position of ultimate authority. The moon goddess certainly had a sense of humor. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Hartwell entered, her expression more respectful than I had ever seen it. Miss Blackthorne, she said formally, Alpha Donovan requests your presence in his private study. I stood up, smoothing down my servant's uniform one last time. When I left this room, I would no longer be Luna Blackthorne, the contracted servant. I would be Luna Blackthorne, future mate of Alpha Donovan, and Luna of the Ironclad Pack. As I followed Mrs. Hartwell through the corridors I had cleaned and polished for months, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had been sold by my family, threatened by ambitious wolves, and forced to hide my true feelings. But I had also discovered my inner strength, found my destined mate, and learned that sometimes the moon goddess's plans were more wonderful than anything we could imagine for ourselves. The door to Alpha Donovan's study opened, and I stepped inside to begin the next chapter of my life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them not as a servant, but as an equal partner to one of the most powerful alphas in the region. The girl who had been sold for gold was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had claimed her destiny and was ready to fight for her future. Alpha Donovan looked up as I entered, and the smile that spread across his face was like sunshine after a storm. Hello, Luna, he said, using my name like a caress. Are you ready to become my queen? I thought of my mother's pendant, still hidden beneath my uniform, and the stories she used to tell about mates chosen by the moon goddess herself. I thought of Tommy, and how proud he would be when he learned that his sister had risen from servant to Luna. I thought of all the wolves in the pack who would now look to me for leadership and guidance. Yes, I said, my voice strong and sure. I'm ready. As Alpha Donovan rose from his desk and moved toward me, I knew that my real story was just beginning. The moon goddess had brought us together through trials and tribulations, but she had also given us the strength to overcome every obstacle. I had been sold by my family for gold, but I had returned as something far more valuable, the chosen mate of a powerful alpha and a woman who had learned that her worth could never be measured in currency. The future stretched ahead of us, full of challenges and possibilities, but we would face it together, and that made all the struggles worthwhile. Legal disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, real events, or real institutions is purely coincidental. The supernatural elements, werewolf concepts, pack dynamics, and romantic scenarios are fictional and not intended to represent actual beliefs or promote any particular lifestyle. This is a work of fantasy romance fiction intended for mature audiences.